Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A routine flight, a shattered piece. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the Atlanta skyline, casting an orange hue over the tarmac. Dr. Elijah Bennett, a 38-year-old cardiothoracic surgeon, tugged at the strap of his duffel bag as he made his way through the bustling airport terminal. His white coat, folded neatly and tucked under one arm, was a stark reminder of the grueling 16-hour shift he'd just completed. Every muscle in his body ached, his eyes burned from lack of sleep, and his mind buzzed with fragments of diagnoses and procedures. He longed for the few hours of peace the flight to Chicago would offer. The promise of a quiet evening, before diving back into the chaos of saving lives, was the only thing keeping him upright. As Elijah reached the boarding gate, he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. His presence drew glances, some curious, others wary. He was used to it. A black man in a tailored suit, carrying the quiet confidence of a professional, always seemed to unsettle people. He straightened his back, plastered on a polite smile, and handed his boarding pass to the agent. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Bennett," she said, her tone professional, but warm. He nodded, stepping onto the jet bridge and into the plane. The cabin hummed with activity, passengers jostled to stow luggage, children clambered into seats, and the faint scent of airline coffee lingered in the air. Elijah found his seat, 7B, an aisle seat in the main cabin, with just enough legroom to stretch. He exhaled deeply as he sank into the seat, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. The flight was scheduled to last just under 2 hours, a short respite, but one he desperately needed. He closed his eyes and let the murmurs of the cabin lull him into a semi-relaxed state. The flight attendant. As passengers settled, a flight attendant named Karen Prescott began her pre-flight checks. With a polished appearance and a meticulous attention to detail, Karen had worked for the airline for over a decade. She prided herself on maintaining order and efficiency, though her demeanor often tipped into sternness. Karen scanned the cabin with a practiced eye, noting the man in 7B. He stood out, not just because of his professional attire, but because of the undeniable weariness etched into his features. Something about him seemed out of place to her, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. When the passenger in 7C, a young woman struggling to fit her bag into the overhead compartment, caught her attention, Karen approached. "Sir," she addressed Elijah, her tone brisk, "could you assist her with her bag?" Elijah blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice calm but tinged with confusion, "but I'm not sure I'm the best person for that right now." He gestured subtly to his arms, still sore from the long hours of surgery. "Perhaps another passenger or crew member could help?" Karen's lips thinned. "It's common courtesy," she said, her voice tightening. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "I understand, ma'am, but I've just finished a long shift at the hospital. I'm physically drained. I mean no disrespect, but I'd prefer to rest." Karen's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "I see," she said curtly, turning to assist the woman herself. The tipping point. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Karen couldn't shake the encounter. She prided herself on being able to read people, and something about Elijah didn't sit right with her. She convinced herself it wasn't personal, just a matter of maintaining order. Still, the perceived slight gnawed at her. Midway through the flight, as the beverage service began, Karen approached Elijah's row again. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her tone clipped. "A bottle of water, please," Elijah replied, his voice even. Karen handed him the water but held onto it for a moment longer than necessary. "You know," she said, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "a little gratitude goes a long way." Elijah frowned, unsure of what to make of the comment. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Karen's expression hardened. "You might find people more willing to help you if you weren't so dismissive." The air in the cabin seemed to shift as nearby passengers turned their heads. Elijah felt a flush of heat rise to his face. He met Karen's gaze, his tone measured but resolute. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I've been nothing but polite." Karen's voice rose slightly, drawing more attention. Polite? Refusing to help your fellow passengers isn't exactly polite. Elijah's jaw tightened. Ma'am, I explained that I was physically unable to assist earlier. I don't appreciate being publicly chastised for it. The tension between them crackled, the silence in the surrounding rose deafening. Karen, unwilling to back down, leaned closer. Maybe if you carried yourself differently, people wouldn't. Before she could finish, a passenger in the adjacent row interjected. That's enough, the older man said, his tone sharp. He hasn't done anything wrong. Leave him alone. A breaking point. Karen straightened, her face flushing with embarrassment. Instead of defusing the situation, she doubled down. Sir, I don't think this concerns you. It concerns all of us when you're singling someone out for no reason, the man shot back. Elijah took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. He'd spent his life navigating moments like this, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways people tried to undermine his dignity. But he refused to let this escalate further. Let's all remain calm, he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Karen, however, wasn't ready to let it go. She moved a step closer, and in her frustration, she did something unthinkable. She swatted at Elijah's hand as he reached for the water bottle. The impact was light but deliberate, and the gasp that rippled through the cabin was instantaneous. Elijah froze, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Passengers stared in stunned silence, the gravity of the moment sinking in. The pilot, alerted by the commotion, emerged from the cockpit. What's going on here? He demanded, his voice authoritative. A young woman in the front row spoke up. She hit him, she said, pointing at Karen. I saw it. The pilot's expression darkened. Ms. Prescott, please step into the galley. Consequences unfold. Karen followed the pilot, her face pale. Passengers began murmuring among themselves, some pulling out phones to document the aftermath. The pilot returned moments later, addressing the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. The situation is being handled. He turned to Elijah. Dr. Bennett, on behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize. Please know this matter will be addressed immediately. Elijah nodded, his face impassive but his heart pounding. He felt the weight of every eye in the cabin on him, the shame and anger warring within him. 10 minutes later, the plane made an unscheduled landing, and Karen was escorted off by airline personnel. The passengers erupted into applause, a gesture of support for Elijah. But as the flight resumed its journey, Elijah knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. What happened next would test his resolve, his faith, and his belief in justice. Dr. Elijah Bennett remained seated in 7B, his mind swirling as the plane leveled out after its brief and unscheduled landing. He stared out the window at the fading twilight, a swirling blend of orange and purple that mirrored the tumult inside him. The applause from the other passengers still echoed faintly in his ears, but it did little to quell the storm of emotions within. It wasn't just anger. It was humiliation, exhaustion, disbelief. Elijah had faced moments like this before, moments where his very existence seemed to invite scrutiny, judgment, or worse. But this? This was something else. He had spent the past decade working tirelessly, clawing his way through medical school, grueling residencies, and long nights in the hospital to become one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in the country. Yet, here he was, reduced to a spectacle, forced to defend his dignity against an unjust and baseless attack. The murmurs of passengers filled the cabin, a low hum of indignation and curiosity. Some exchanged glances with him, their eyes filled with quiet solidarity or embarrassment on his behalf. Others simply whispered to their companions, their voices tinged with the thrill of witnessing something extraordinary, even scandalous. Elijah ignored them all, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Excuse me, Dr. Bennett? Elijah turned to see the flight's senior attendant, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, standing in the aisle. His uniform was crisp, but his expression was fraught with concern. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened earlier. That behavior was unacceptable, and I assure you it's being addressed. Elijah nodded, appreciating the sentiment but too drained to respond with more than a polite acknowledgement. Thank you, he said simply, his voice steady but distant. The attendant hesitated, then added, if there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. The airline will be reaching out to you to formally address this incident once we land. Elijah offered a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I appreciate that, he replied, then turned back toward the window, effectively ending the conversation. The rest of the flight passed in a surreal haze. Elijah tried to focus on anything but the incident, on the patients waiting for him in Chicago, on the small stack of medical journals in his bag, even on the safety instructions tucked into the seat pocket in front of him. But his mind kept circling back, replaying Karen Prescott's words, her actions, the way she had swatted his hand with such casual contempt, as if he were an unruly child instead of a paying passenger. When the plane finally touched down in Chicago, Elijah was among the last to disembark. He waited until most of the other passengers had left, partly to avoid the sympathetic glances and partly to gather himself. As he stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, he was greeted by a representative from the airline, a woman in a sharp navy suit with a badge identifying her as Emily Wright, regional manager. Dr. Bennett, she began, her tone professional yet tinged with genuine regret, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our deepest apologies for what you experienced during your flight. The behavior you were subjected to is completely unacceptable and does not reflect our values. Elijah regarded her carefully. She seemed sincere, but he had learned long ago that sincerity didn't always translate into meaningful action. Still, he nodded. I appreciate your acknowledgement, Ms. Wright. We're conducting a full investigation into the incident, and I assure you that appropriate measures will be taken. In the meantime, we'd like to offer you a full refund for your ticket, as well as a voucher for future travel. Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. While I appreciate the gesture, Ms. Wright, this isn't about a refund or a voucher. This is about accountability. What happened on that flight was a blatant act of disrespect and discrimination. A simple apology and a free ticket won't erase that. Emily's expression tightened slightly, though she maintained her composure. I completely understand, Dr. Bennett. Please know that we take these matters very seriously. If there's anything else we can do. There is, Elijah interrupted, his voice firm but measured. Ensure that your policies and training address incidents like this. Make sure that no one else has to endure what I did. And hold your employees accountable when they cross the line. Emily nodded, her demeanor shifting slightly from polished professionalism to genuine respect. Understood. I'll make sure your concerns are communicated to the appropriate parties. With that, Elijah turned and walked away, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The weight of the day, and the confrontation, settled heavily on him as he exited the terminal and hailed a cab. The drive to his apartment was mercifully quiet, the city lights flickering past like distant stars. Once home, Elijah dropped his bag by the door and sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. He had dealt with microaggressions his entire life, from classmates who doubted his intelligence to colleagues who underestimated his abilities. But this was different. This wasn't subtle or veiled. It was open, blatant, and humiliating. As he sat there, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at the screen, dozens of missed calls and messages from friends, family, and colleagues who had either heard about the incident or seen videos of it circulating online. Apparently, some passengers had recorded the altercation and posted it to social media, where it had quickly gone viral. The hashtags #JusticeForDrBennett and #accountability in the airline industry were already trending. Elijah hesitated before picking up his phone. Part of him wanted to retreat, to shut out the world and avoid the inevitable onslaught of attention. But another part of him, one that had been honed through years of resilience and determination, knew that this was an opportunity to spark change. He began scrolling through the messages, pausing to read a text from his younger sister, Mia, a civil rights attorney based in Washington, D.C. Mia. Eli, I saw the video. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Let me know how I can help. If you want to take legal action, I can connect you with someone. Whatever you decide, I've got your back. Elijah exhaled deeply, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. Mia had always been his fiercest advocate, and knowing she was in his corner gave him a small measure of comfort. He replied with a brief, "Thanks, Mia. I'll call you tomorrow," then set his phone down. As the night stretched on, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was bigger than him. It wasn't just about what happened on that flight. It was about the countless others who had faced similar indignities, those whose stories hadn't gone viral, who hadn't received apologies or promises of accountability. By the time the sun began to rise, Elijah had made a decision. He would use this moment not just to seek justice for himself, but to advocate for broader systemic change. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but he was no stranger to hard work. He had spent his life fighting for others. Now, it was time to fight for himself and for the countless others who deserved dignity and respect. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Elijah Bennett would not be silenced. Dr. Elijah Bennett woke up to a cacophony of notifications buzzing on his phone, the light from the screen illuminating the dim room. He squinted at the brightness and reached for the device, half expecting the barrage of messages to have died down overnight. Instead, they had multiplied. Social media had turned the incident into a wildfire of public discourse, with opinions, hashtags, and debates spreading across platforms like an unstoppable wave. Elijah sat up, rubbing his temples as he scrolled through the updates. The video of the incident had gained millions of views. Comment sections were flooded with outrage, sympathy, and, predictably, a few contrarian takes accusing him of overreacting or questioning the authenticity of the situation. But the overwhelming sentiment was one of support. Strangers from across the globe were calling for justice, some tagging the airline in demands for action, while others shared their own stories of mistreatment. The incident had struck a chord far deeper than Elijah had anticipated. He noticed several messages from journalists requesting interviews, some from local outlets, others from national networks. His email inbox was flooded with similar requests. Among the messages, he saw another from his sister, Mia, sent early that morning. Mia. Morning, Eli. The story's blowing up. Call me ASAP. We need to discuss your next steps. Elijah dialed her number, and she answered almost immediately. Eli. Finally, Mia's voice was a mix of relief and urgency. How are you holding up? I'm fine, Mia, Elijah replied, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed him. This whole thing is overwhelming. I didn't expect it to become this. Of course it did, she said firmly. This isn't just about you, Eli. It's about a system that allows things like this to happen. You're a doctor, for God's sake, a man who saves lives, and even you weren't spared. Imagine what happens to people without your credentials or platform. This is bigger than you think. Elijah sighed. I know. That's what's been keeping me up all night. I want to do something, but I don't even know where to start. I didn't ask for this spotlight. None of us ask for these moments, Eli, Mia said, her tone softening. But when they come, we have to decide what to do with them. You have an opportunity here, not just to seek accountability for what happened to you, but to push for change. People are listening. They spent the next hour discussing possible steps. Mia suggested hiring a public relations firm to help manage the media attention and craft a message that emphasized systemic issues. She also recommended pursuing legal action, not just to hold the airline accountable, but to set a precedent that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Elijah was hesitant at first, but the more they talked, the more he realized Mia was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. Later that afternoon, Elijah met with a lawyer Mia had recommended, a sharp and empathetic woman named Anita Crawford. Anita had handled several high-profile discrimination cases and came highly regarded in legal circles. As they sat across from each other in her sleek downtown office, Elijah recounted the events of the flight in painstaking detail. Anita listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Dr. Bennett, first let me say I'm deeply sorry for what you experienced. It's unacceptable on every level. Based on what you described, and the video evidence, I believe we have a strong case. This isn't just about the physical act, it's about the pattern of behavior leading up to it, the humiliation, and the clear disregard for your dignity." "What kind of case are we talking about?" Elijah asked, his voice steady but laced with apprehension. "We could pursue several avenues," Anita explained. "A civil lawsuit for emotional distress, potentially a claim under anti-discrimination laws, depending on the findings of our investigation. We'll also push for policy changes within the airline to address training and accountability. This could be about more than compensation, it could be about setting a new standard." Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling on him. "I want to move forward," he said finally. "But I don't want this to turn into a spectacle. I want the focus to be on the bigger picture, not just me." "That's admirable, Dr. Bennett," Anita said with a small smile. "And it's exactly why this case matters. We'll proceed thoughtfully, ensuring that your story is told in a way that highlights the systemic issues at play." As the days passed, the media frenzy only grew. Elijah reluctantly agreed to a few carefully selected interviews, each one focused not on the sensationalism of the incident but on the broader implications. He spoke about the microaggressions and outright discrimination that people of color faced daily, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove one's worth in spaces where they were often undervalued. His calm demeanor and eloquence resonated with audiences, turning him into an unexpected voice for change. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to control the damage. They issued a public apology, announced an internal investigation, and placed Karen Prescott on administrative leave. But the public wasn't satisfied. Advocacy groups began calling for boycotts, demanding that the airline take meaningful steps to address systemic biases within their ranks. Elijah found himself thrust into meetings with civil rights organizations, community leaders, and corporate diversity consultants. Though it wasn't a role he had sought, he embraced it, recognizing the opportunity to channel his experience into tangible outcomes. He worked closely with Mia and Anita, crafting proposals for policy changes that included mandatory bias training for airline staff, stronger protocols for handling passenger complaints, and clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. One evening, as Elijah was reviewing documents at home, he received an email from a former patient. It was a young man he had operated on years ago, a college student who had been on the brink of death after a car accident. The subject line read, "Thank you, Dr. Bennett." The message was short but heartfelt. The young man thanked Elijah for saving his life, expressing gratitude not just for the surgery but for the compassion Elijah had shown him and his family during their darkest hour. The email ended with a simple but powerful line, "You've already changed lives, Dr. Bennett. Now you're changing the world." Elijah sat back in his chair, the words sinking in. He hadn't set out to become an activist or a symbol of resilience, but the role had found him nonetheless. And as daunting as it was, he knew he couldn't turn away from it. He thought about his parents, who had worked tirelessly to provide him and Mia with opportunities they had never known. He thought about his mentors, who had believed in him even when others doubted his potential. And he thought about every patient who had trusted him with their life. This fight, he realized, wasn't just about what had happened on that flight. It was about honoring all the sacrifices and support that had brought him to this moment. It was about using his voice to advocate for those who couldn't, to push for a world where dignity and respect weren't privileges but basic rights. Elijah closed his laptop and stood, his gaze drifting to the window. The city lights stretched out before him, a reminder of the countless lives intersecting in ways both profound and fleeting. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination that steadied him as he prepared for the battles ahead. This was just the beginning. And Elijah Bennett was ready. The courtroom was filled with a tense energy, the kind that came with knowing that something significant was about to unfold. Dr. Elijah Bennett sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his attorney Anita Crawford and a small legal team. Though outwardly composed, a subtle clenching and unclenching of his hands betrayed the nerves beneath his polished demeanor. Across the room, representatives for the airlines sat with their own legal team, their faces a mix of stoicism and quiet apprehension. It had taken months to get to this point. Months of depositions, evidence gathering, and tireless preparation. Anita had been meticulous in building the case, compiling not just the footage of the incident but also a growing list of testimonies from passengers and former employees who described similar patterns of mistreatment by the airline. What had begun as an isolated incident had evolved into a broader examination of systemic failings, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have anticipated. The case had captured national attention, drawing reporters, activists, and everyday citizens to the courthouse steps. Outside, crowds held signs bearing slogans like "Accountability Now" and "Justice for All Travelers." Though Elijah had avoided the spectacle as much as possible, he couldn't ignore the growing sense that this was about more than just him. It was about a movement, a collective demand for change that had taken root in the wake of his story. The judge entered the courtroom and everyone rose. Elijah took a deep breath as the proceedings began. The opening statements were succinct but powerful. Anita outlined the case with precision, emphasizing not only the humiliation and physical assault Elijah had endured but also the airline's broader pattern of negligence in addressing discriminatory behavior among its staff. The airline's attorney countered with a carefully crafted narrative, attempting to frame the incident as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But Elijah could see the cracks in their argument, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were fighting an uphill battle. When it was time for Elijah to take the stand, he felt a momentary pang of doubt. The courtroom was packed, and cameras from media outlets loomed in the back, their lenses trained on him. He knew his words would be dissected, analyzed, and broadcast to millions. But as he looked out over the crowd, he saw Mia in the front row, her gaze steady and encouraging. He saw other supporters, patients, colleagues, and strangers who had been moved by his story. Their presence bolstered him, grounding him as he began to speak. Anita guided him through his testimony with skill, allowing him to recount the events of the flight in vivid detail. Elijah spoke about his exhaustion after a grueling shift, his hope for a moment of peace on the plane, and the growing discomfort as the flight attendant's behavior escalated. He described the humiliation he felt when Karen Prescott publicly chastised him, the disbelief and anger when she struck his hand, and the lingering impact of that moment. It wasn't just about what she did, Elijah said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. It was about what it represented. It was a reminder that no matter how hard I work, no matter what I achieve, there are still people who see me as less. And that's something no one should have to endure. The room was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. When Anita finished her questioning, the airline's attorney rose for cross-examination. Elijah braced himself, knowing this was where they would attempt to undermine his credibility. The attorney's questions were pointed, their tone veiled in politeness, but sharp enough to draw blood. They questioned his interpretation of events, suggesting that Karen's actions might have been misconstrued. They brought up his exhaustion, implying that his fatigue might have colored his perception of the interaction. But Elijah held his ground, responding with clarity and conviction. "Are you suggesting," he said at one point, his tone measured, "that my exhaustion somehow justifies being publicly humiliated and physically struck? Because I fail to see how those things are connected." The attorney faltered, their next question landing with less force. By the time Elijah stepped down, it was clear that their strategy had failed to shake his credibility. Over the next several days, both sides presented their cases. Witnesses testified, including passengers who corroborated Elijah's account and described the collective shock they felt during the incident. Former employees of the airline came forward with stories of a toxic work culture where discriminatory behavior was often ignored or dismissed. Karen Prescott herself took the stand, her demeanor a mix of defiance and regret. While she offered a formal apology, her testimony was riddled with contradictions that did little to help the airline's case. The turning point came when Anita introduced evidence of internal communications within the airline. Emails and reports revealed that complaints about Karen's behavior had been lodged before, but little action had been taken. The documents painted a damning picture of an organization that prioritized optics over accountability, undermining the airline's claims that the incident was an isolated mistake. As the trial neared its conclusion, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly charged. Both sides delivered closing arguments that sought to sway the jury, but it was Anita's words that lingered most. "This case is about more than what happened to Dr. Bennett," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "It's about what happens when we allow prejudice, unchecked power, and a lack of accountability to permeate our institutions. Dr. Bennett is not just fighting for himself, he's fighting for every person who has been made to feel small, every person who has been denied their dignity. This is a moment to say, enough. Enough excuses. Enough indifference. It's time for change." The jury deliberated for hours, each minute stretching into eternity. Elijah sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Mia and Anita, their conversation alternating between strategy discussions and lighter topics meant to distract from the tension. When the bailiff finally announced that a verdict had been reached, Elijah felt his heart race as he returned to the courtroom. The jury filed in, their expressions neutral as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. Elijah gripped the edge of the table, his pulse pounding in his ears. "In the matter of Dr. Elijah Bennett versus Northern Skies Airlines," the foreperson began, "we find in favor of the plaintiff." The words hit Elijah like a wave, a rush of relief and vindication washing over him. The court awarded significant damages, citing not only the emotional and physical toll on Elijah but also the airline's negligence in addressing systemic issues. More importantly, the ruling included a mandate for the airline to implement comprehensive reforms, including bias training, transparent complaint processes, and regular audits to ensure accountability. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge adjourned the session. Elijah remained seated for a moment, letting the reality of the verdict sink in. When he finally stood, Mia enveloped him in a tight hug. "You did it, Eli," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Anita joined them, her expression a mix of satisfaction and pride. "This is a victory," she said. "Not just for you, but for everyone who needed to see that justice is possible." Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters cheered as Elijah emerged. Reporters shouted questions, but he raised a hand for silence before addressing the crowd. "This verdict is not just a win for me," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "It's a step forward in a larger fight for equity and accountability. My hope is that this case will inspire continued conversations and actions to ensure that everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Thank you to everyone who stood by me and believed in this cause." As the crowd erupted into applause, Elijah felt a sense of closure, though he knew the work was far from over. This was a milestone, but the journey toward justice and systemic change was ongoing. Still, for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of peace. He had turned a moment of pain into a catalyst for progress, and that, he realized, was a victory worth celebrating. The months following the trial were a whirlwind of activity for Dr. Elijah Bennett. While the courtroom battle had concluded with a resounding victory, the work it catalyzed was only beginning. What had initially been a deeply personal ordeal had transformed into a movement, and Elijah found himself at the center of a national conversation about equity, accountability, and systemic reform. His days were no longer defined solely by the meticulous rhythm of surgery and patient care. Instead, they were filled with speaking engagements, meetings with advocacy groups, and collaborations with policymakers. Elijah was invited to conferences on diversity and inclusion, where he shared his story and insights with audiences eager to learn from his experience. Though he hadn't sought the spotlight, he understood the weight of the platform he had been given and the responsibility it carried. One of his first initiatives post-trial was the establishment of a nonprofit organization, Elevate Equity, aimed at addressing systemic biases in professional environments. With Mia as co-founder and Anita as a board advisor, the organization quickly gained traction. Its mission was ambitious: to provide education, resources, and advocacy for individuals and institutions striving to create equitable spaces. Through workshops, mentorship programs, and policy consulting, Elevate Equity aimed to turn conversations into concrete action. The first major project was a partnership with Northern Skies Airlines. While the trial had compelled the airline to implement reforms, Elijah saw an opportunity to go beyond the court-mandated measures. Working with the company's leadership, he and his team helped design a comprehensive bias training program that emphasized empathy, accountability, and cultural competency. They also developed a mentorship program to support underrepresented employees in advancing their careers within the organization. It wasn't always easy. The initial meetings with Northern Skies executives were tense, laden with the lingering resentment of the lawsuit. Some employees viewed the reforms as performative or unnecessary, resistant to what they perceived as forced change. But Elijah's calm, methodical approach, rooted in data and personal experience, won over many skeptics. Slowly but surely, the airline began to embrace the changes as not just necessary, but transformative. Beyond the airline, Elijah's work extended into healthcare, his primary field of expertise. He collaborated with hospitals and medical schools to address biases in patient care and training. As a Black doctor, Elijah had long been aware of the disparities faced by minority patients, from unequal access to treatment to the dismissal of their pain. He used his experiences and platform to advocate for systemic change, speaking at medical conferences and authoring articles in prestigious journals. His efforts led to the creation of a nationwide task force on healthcare equity, a coalition of doctors, administrators, and policymakers working to dismantle systemic barriers. Amid these professional endeavors, Elijah made a conscious effort to maintain balance in his life. The trial and its aftermath had taken a toll on him, both mentally and physically. Therapy became a regular part of his routine, a space where he could process the trauma and emotional weight of the past year. He also leaned on his family and friends, finding solace in their unwavering support. Mia remained his closest confidant, her sharp legal mind and fierce determination a constant source of inspiration. They often spent late nights brainstorming ideas for Elevate Equity, their conversations ranging from strategic plans to memories of their childhood. It was during one such conversation that Mia suggested expanding the organization's reach to include educational initiatives for younger generations. "We need to start earlier," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "If we can teach kids about equity, empathy, and inclusion, we'll be shaping the leaders of tomorrow." Elijah agreed, and together they developed a pilot program for schools, offering workshops and resources to foster inclusive environments. The program, aptly named Seeds of Change, launched in a handful of schools and quickly garnered positive feedback from educators and students alike. Within a year, it had expanded to dozens of schools across the country. Despite the progress, Elijah was not naive about the challenges that remained. The backlash to his work was inevitable, ranging from online harassment to more insidious forms of resistance. Some critics accused him of pushing an agenda, while others dismissed his efforts as symbolic rather than substantive. Elijah faced these criticisms with the same resilience that had carried him through the trial, choosing to focus on the allies and progress rather than the detractors. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Elijah found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He was sitting in his Chicago apartment, the city lights twinkling outside the window. On the coffee table before him was a stack of letters from supporters, patients who had been inspired by his advocacy, students who had participated in Seeds of Change, and strangers who simply wanted to thank him for speaking out. One letter, in particular, caught his eye. It was from an airline employee, a flight attendant who had been part of the initial bias training program at Northern Skies. The letter was heartfelt, detailing how the training had changed her perspective and given her the tools to recognize and address her own biases. "I used to think I was just doing my job," the letter read. "But now I understand how much power I have to make someone feel seen, respected, and valued. I can't thank you enough for helping me see that." Elijah set the letter down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Moments like this reminded him why he had chosen to embrace this path, despite its challenges. Change was slow, often frustratingly so, but it was happening. And while he couldn't erase the pain of what had happened on that flight, he could use it as a catalyst for something greater. In the years that followed, Elijah's impact continued to grow. Elevate Equity became a national leader in advocacy and reform, influencing industries far beyond airlines and healthcare. The organization's annual conference drew thousands of attendees, from CEOs to grassroots activists, all united in their commitment to creating a more equitable world. Elijah's work earned him numerous accolades, but he remained grounded, viewing each award as a reminder of the collective effort behind the progress. He often deflected the spotlight, emphasizing the importance of community and collaboration. On the anniversary of the trial's verdict, Elijah stood on the stage of the Elevate Equity Conference, addressing an audience of thousands. As he spoke, he reflected not just on the journey that had brought him here, but on the countless people who had joined him along the way. This movement is not about one person or one case, he said, his voice steady and resonant. It's about all of us, about the choices we make every day to stand up for what's right, to challenge systems that perpetuate harm, and to build a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with each of us. And together, we can make it unstoppable. The crowd erupted into applause, a standing ovation that seemed to echo with the collective resolve of everyone in the room. Elijah felt a surge of emotion as he looked out at the sea of faces, each one a testament to the power of resilience, justice, and the fight for dignity. As he stepped off the stage, Mia was waiting for him, her eyes shining with pride. "You've come a long way, Eli," she said, pulling him into a hug. "We all have," he replied, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. And as they stood there, surrounded by the hum of progress and possibility, Elijah knew that the journey was far from over. But for the first time, he felt a profound sense of peace. Together, they were building something enduring, something that would outlast them all. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all.